Good afternoon, everyone. So my name's Mark Maloney, and I'm the Vice Dean at the Paris School of International Affairs, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first PSIA event, the weekly event. Obviously, we had our big Youth and Leaders Summit last Friday, and hopefully many of you were at that. But in terms of our regular semester weekly events, this is the first one of not just this semester, but of course of the year 2024. So we're delighted to have a good crowd here. And let me say, even before I begin that, first of all, welcome back to our second year students who, of course, have been either doing internships, writing master's thesis, or potentially on exchange in different parts of the world, and so haven't been with us since last May, so you're all very welcome back. And of course, to the first year students who were with us as recently as December, it's always nice to welcome you back in January to the start of another academic session. I also want to welcome, we have a group of laureates from what's called the Marianne Initiative of the government of France. And they're with us this week for a training program on negotiation. These are people who defend human rights, in fact, in many of the countries which will be discussed as part of the today's event. And we're delighted to have them here with us, down here at the front of the thing. And I hope that during the question and answer, that they may also have particular questions relating to some of the countries you're going to hear about. And we think that'll be an enriching experience, both for them and, of course, for you as well. So today's talk, as you know, is called Humanitarian Crisis in 2024. And we're delighted to have Mr Désir with us from the International Rescue Committee. Some of you may have been at the talk last year. We presented the same report last year. Obviously, many things have changed in that time, although depressingly, some things have gotten even worse. And Harlem will tell us a little bit about that. But I will let Anne Charbord, who's going to moderate today's event, both to frame the discussion more broadly and to introduce Harlem a little bit more fully. But let me take a minute to introduce and to thank Anne for being with us today. She is an international human rights lawyer. She's an adjunct faculty and teaches a course which probably some of you have or are taking. Her focus is really on human rights and security. She spent 7 years at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Prior to that, she also spent 4 years in the Balkans, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Kosovo with the OSCE. And she's currently working as a senior consultant, advising UN bodies, agencies, and experts, as well as NGOs, on questions linked to human rights and counterterrorism. So, Anne, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mahoney. So good afternoon, good evening maybe already, and welcome. I'm really delighted to be here today to today's event organized by Sciences Po PSIA, which is entitled Humanitarian Crises in 2024, How to Protect the Most Vulnerable and Break the Cycle. And when I was thinking about how to start introducing this topic, and of course reading the report that we'll be discussing later, I thought the best way to start was by illustrating what humanitarian crisis means in today's world by providing some rather alarming statistics. 299.4 million people are currently in need of humanitarian assistance, and the number of people in need increased more than fourfold between 2014 and 2023. The number of forcibly displaced persons has passed 110 million in 2023 for the first time since the records began, and has more than doubled in the last decade. 273.8 million people are experiencing crisis or worse levels of food insecurity. 659 million people are living in extreme poverty, and 90% of casualties in conflicts are civilians. Now, the International Rescue Committee has just published its flagship 2024 Emergency Watchlist report, which identifies and reports on the 20 countries most at risk of worsening humanitarian need. The report itself has an interesting story. It was initially an internal document, a prediction tool for the IRC to determine where the worst humanitarian deteriorations in crisis for the next year would be, and therefore where the organization should focus its preparedness efforts. However, given both its accuracy in predicting crises, but also the detailed analysis of the trends that are contained in the report, it's now published and available for us all to see. And as I'm sure will be discussed, it's worrying to note that states identified on the watch list, even though they represent a very small percentage of the world's global population, concentrate an overwhelming percentage of individuals in need of humanitarian aid, of forcibly displaced persons, and of extreme levels of poverty, and that in these countries, the figures are disproportionately growing. So to discuss the Landmarks Report's findings, but also the trends and the analysis that underpin them, I'm delighted and in fact honored to have the Vice President of the International Rescue Committee, Mr. Harlem Désir, next to me today. Mr. Désir, you don't need much presentation, but I would nonetheless like to highlight some of your immense accomplishments. First, as a politician, where you held numerous governmental roles in French and European politics, including 3 consecutive terms as a member of the European Parliament, the position of First Secretary of the French Socialist Party, and as French Minister of State for European Affairs, which you had from 2014. But also as an activist and militant for human rights, refugee rights, and non-discrimination. You co-founded the French not-for-profit association SOS Racisme in 1984 to fight against racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of discrimination. And in 1989, you also co-founded the International Federation of SOS Racisme. You were appointed as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media in 2017, a position that you held until 2020. And you are now the International Rescue Committee Vice President, a position which you have held since 2021. Mr. Désir, we are immensely grateful for your time, for your presence, and the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Anne Charbord. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank Marc Maloney, the Executive Director and Vice Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs, and the Dean of the school, Mrs. Arantxa Gonzalez, for their invitation to present for the second consecutive year this report, the Emergency Watchlist 2024, which is, as you just said, a report which was first an internal exercise for preparedness, and which is now made public since a decade, so that we can share widely our analysis. We can alert also on the situation of countries that we see at risk of humanitarian deterioration for the year to come. And we can also discuss and share with government, with the United Nations, with other humanitarian organizations, and with academics and the wider public, our proposals and solutions to answer to the crisis that we see coming. This report is made with the analysis of a lot of quantitative and qualitative data, as well as based on the insights that we get from our teams who are working in more than 50 countries in the world. And then we, from that, select those 20 countries, ranking the 10 first, where we see a risk of deterioration and important needs in the humanitarian field for the year ahead. Maybe just for those of you who don't know the International Rescue Committee, it's an international humanitarian organization which was first founded at the call of Albert Einstein in 1933 to welcome refugees fleeing Europe and the Nazi regime and occupation of other European countries, but also of Germany in the US, and it has since then become an international humanitarian organization. Our mission is to help people whose lives and livelihood are shattered by conflict or disaster, including the climate crisis, to survive, to recover, and to regain control over their future. And our programs span emergency response, but also health, education, economic well-being, protection and empowerment of women and girls, and other life-changing services. And even if we are first coming where there is an emergency, we most of the time stay very long in the countries where we are, because the crises are protracted. So maybe before we go in the watch list presentation itself, we will see a short video about it. It will make it easier than for me to speak about the content, and then I will be happy to present the main highlights of the watch list and to have a discussion with you and with Mrs. Charbord, so that we can answer to questions and listen to your remarks, because I know that a lot of you knows a lot already about these countries, or even come from some of these countries. Thank you very much, and we can look at the short video. Thank you.
If you want to understand what's driving humanitarian crises, you need to understand the IRC's Emergency Watchlist. Each year it reveals 20 countries facing new and worsening emergencies and how we cut through the myths to get to solutions. When you read the Emergency Watchlist, you'll see that when governments can't meet citizens' needs, armed groups can form, and how this triggers new conflicts and intensifies old ones. And if global or regional powers intervene, things can get worse, not better. You'll understand that conflict destroys the systems people need, like healthcare and food production, and this impact is felt today and for generations. The myth is we can fix the problem by just delivering supplies, like food and medicine. The fact is, if we deliver flour to a war-affected community, but conflict and drought have left them without water to make bread, we haven't done enough. People need ongoing access to services to care for their families. Now that you know these facts about conflict, you need to know this about climate change. Climate change makes the devastation of conflict even worse. When violence and extreme weather converge, even more people go hungry and lose their homes and livelihoods. And it's a myth that by cutting emissions, we can avoid the climate crisis. The climate crisis is here, now, and we need to help people in conflict zones adapt. When you understand these facts, you can ignore the myths. And when you read the Emergency Watchlist, you'll see how, together, we can get to real and lasting solutions. Read the 2024 Emergency Watchlist at rescue.org.
Thank you very much. So this is the list of the 20 countries which are on the watch list for 2024. I don't know if you can see them on the other screen, also in the room. I will speak about the trends, the myths that were referred to in the video, and the recommendations, the solutions that we promote. But first, let's have a look on this list and what we learned from this. So the top 10 countries are ranked, the other ones are not. It's the first time that Sudan is coming first on the list. I will not elaborate on each of the countries, that will be too long, maybe just say a few words later on the three first. Second one is Gaza, in fact, and it doesn't come as a surprise. The third one is South Sudan. Then you have another African country, Burkina Faso, then Myanmar, then again other African countries, and it's also a fact that there is among the top 10, 8 African countries, and among the 20 countries on the watch list, 11 African countries. It's the first time that there is so many of them on this list. What we see on this report, and you refer to it, is first a concentration in these 20 countries of the most important part of people in need of humanitarian assistance worldwide. As you said, there is worldwide 299 million people who are in humanitarian need at the beginning of this year, and 86% of them, 258 million, are living in watch list countries. This concentration is not new. it shows the amount of problems that there is in a few countries. It also shows that these humanitarian problems, they are sizable in a way. They are concentrated in a few places in the world. From 2014 to 2023, as you also said it, the number of people in humanitarian need has been multiplied fourfold. It was 76 million. It has been up to 363 million last year. It has decreased a little bit in 24 compared to 23. That's because especially in some countries like Kenya, Malawi, Pakistan, where there has been huge flood, you remember, a year ago, there were heavy responses which were bring. There were also some countries where there has been a truce after years of war, like Yemen, so there has been a decrease of the number of people in risk because the ports were reopened. But Yemen, we see how fragile it is because the situation could degrade very rapidly. There are some countries where there was 5 consecutive failed rain season, like Somalia. Now there is no more droughts, but when you look at the figures, even if there is less people than the previous years in risk of famine, for example, there is still several millions of people in food insecurity. We also see a concentration of the displaced people. As you said, here globally, with 110 million people forcibly displaced worldwide, it's a record high, and 75% of them are coming from watchlist country. Whether they have crossed the border, and we generally speak of refugees, or they stayed in their own country but have to flee their home, they come from these 20 countries. And it's the same concentration that we see also for the people in facing food insecurity, and especially experiencing crisis level of worst level of food insecurity. There is an international classification, and when you are at IPC 3, it's called a crisis level. IPC 4, there is an urgent need for intervention. IPC 5, people are dying every day, especially young children. And we have 162 million people in this situation worldwide, and in these countries, which is 68% of the 237 million people globally facing this food insecurity crisis situation. The concentration in African countries, which we can see maybe from the map of the watchlist country, is something interesting to discuss, and it will be linked to the analysis of the trends of what are the underlying drivers of the crisis in these countries. In many of these countries are confronted both to climate crisis and the impact already of climate change, and to conflict for many diverse reasons, and that's also why there are such a number of African countries in the watch list. Just a few words on, so this is the evolution of the global forced displacement since 2013. So you see that here the situation is increasing, and it's also a consequence of conflict and of climate change. And this is a map we can look again after, but which also shows that not only most of the displaced people are coming from watchlist country, but they are staying in the 20 watchlist country, contrary to some ideas that there is sometimes in Europe or in the US that these two places, these two continents are receiving the vast majority of refugees. It's far from the reality. Most of the refugee or forcibly displaced people are in this poor country. So a few words on the 3 top countries. Sudan has become first on this list because even if it's out of, and it's one of the importance of this list, it's out of the highlight of the media for now, but this is the country where there is more displaced people and the highest number of people in humanitarian need, with the risk of genocide in Darfur, as the fighting are continuing. Since they started in April 2023, they started again after years of war before that. There is impressive deterioration. with half of the population, roughly 25 million people already in humanitarian need, 6 million displaced people. A lot of people have crossed the border to other countries, to South Sudan, to Chad. Gaza, this is now, so it's the first time that this territory is on the watch list. It's since the horrendous terrorist attack of Hamas against Israel on the 7th of October, and then the bombardment of hospitals, infrastructure in Gaza, the denial of humanitarian access, combined with massive displacement of population, which means that more than 2 million people living in Gaza Strip will be in need of humanitarian aid in 2024. It is the deadliest place for civilians in the world now, and we think that it will not improve except if there is a sustained ceasefire. The healthcare system is collapsing, and the food security situation is degrading, and the humanitarian access, as you know, is almost impossible. South Sudan is the third on the list, so another African country which is continuing to suffer from the worst impact of conflict and climate change, especially in that case the impact of El Nino and the flooding. And the flooding are predicted to continue this year, but also the impact of the war in Sudan, which means that refugees are arriving in the country, but also that this country doesn't have any more access to the sea, or at least to its main port, which was a Sudan port, which will lead to increase in food prices, a very important one already, more than 25% in the borders region to Sudan, but also difficulties to export its oil resources. So those are examples through these three countries of some of the diverse situation which lead to countries to be on this list. I will so now go to both the trend and facts that we see, to the myths and to the proposal. So I would like to speak now about 8 trends and facts which we think are explaining the extreme levels of humanitarian crisis. And this is one of the, for us, of the interests of such a report. As it's becoming public, it's not just to have a listing of where we have to be prepared to intervene and to ask for donors or government to support us, but also to discuss and think about what are the reasons. The first one, as you see here, is that armed conflict and climate change are increasingly converging in the same place at the same time. And the percentage of conflict taking place in climate vulnerable countries increased from 44% to 67% over the past 3 decades. I will maybe answering to questions or on occasion of other items, develop a little bit more about this. The second one is that civilians are caught between states and the growing influence of armed groups, whether organized along political, communal, criminal, or any other lines. And weak state capacity and legitimacy is one of the key factors leading to protracted conflict and humanitarian crisis. Weak governance creates space for non-state armed groups to control and influence territories and resources. Armed groups trigger new conflict and intensify old ones, driving further needs, displacement, and food insecurity. And this is something we see from South Sudan to Mali and Haiti, for example, which is also on the list. And governments at times are turning to foreign armed groups, including mercenaries like the Russian-based Wagner Group, for example, in several African countries, such as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Central African Republic. And the number of armed groups in watchlist country is higher than ever. It's several hundreds of armed groups. And, for example, just in the eastern part of another country, which is on the list, the Democratic Republic of Congo, you can have more than 100 armed groups. Usually the media would speak about one of them, for example, the M23, but you have hundreds of others. The same in the north of Nigeria. I've been visiting the country where you have groups from Boko Haram and other groups which are split from the previous Boko Haram grouping, but you have a lot of other armed groups. Some are based on religious lines, some on ethnic one, some are just bandit groups controlling part of the territory. And so it makes it much more difficult to get to any kind of peace deal, of course, because traditional diplomacy doesn't really work with groups which are not linked to a state represented in the UN with ambassadors and capability to negotiate. But also those groups doesn't respect at all the civilian and doesn't care about international humanitarian law. The third fact that we wanted to underline is that regional and global powers are intervening in this conflict, but to drive and intensify them, not to calm them. And this is something we can see, for example, in Sudan, and which also is a factor for the duration of this conflict, because this other state or other power fill the armed groups with the means to continue their battles. And so we have seen a lot of this new internationalized conflict establishing themselves and then having a longer duration. The first thing is that, especially we've seen this last year, violent and unconstitutional leadership transition are increasing the risk of crisis. 5 of the top 10 countries, Mali, Sudan, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Myanmar, have experienced a coup in the last 3 years. And of course, this has increased, in fact, the instability and the intervention also of different armed groups, including foreign groups in the countries. The fifth themes is that civilians and the infrastructure they depend on are increasingly unsafe as parties to conflict disregard their obligation under international law. We are really here seeing a development of what we call the age of impunity, and our teams are seeing this on the ground more and more. I think you mentioned this, 90% of casualties during conflict are civilians. They are not combatants, they are not military, and there is a wide disrespect by most of the actors to any kind of international humanitarian law, which means the law of war, which are supposed to make a distinction between civilian and combatant, between civilian infrastructure and military infrastructure. The sixth fact is that parties to conflict are failing to uphold their responsibility to protect humanitarian access, which means that through many means, they in fact impeach humanitarian actors like us to access to the population, or the population to access to the place where they could have the support of humanitarian intervention. We could give many examples of this through the countries of the watch list. I will mention, for example, Mali and Burkina Faso, where one of the tactics of the non-state groups is to besiege entire city. Maybe you've heard about some of them, like Djibo in Burkina Faso, but there has been dozens of them who have been under siege, which means that it's impossible to have food and water coming to these cities because they are blocked by these groups. Another example is what is happening in Gaza, where it's almost impossible to have the sufficient humanitarian aid accessing the territory, and the humanitarian team working in hospitals, accessing them, traveling within the Gaza Strip, and also where we have seen record high of UN aid workers killed in the first months. Only, I think it was more than 100 UN aid workers who were killed during the bombing. The seventh fact that we want to highlight is that there is a heightened exposure to climate crisis, which is threatening lives and livelihood right now. And El Nino could exacerbate this in some watchlist countries. Communities in watchlist countries contribute the least to climate change, only 1.7% of global carbon emissions in 2021. But the people living in these countries are 2.75 times more likely to be affected by natural hazard. And so the watch list countries are very much exposed to drought, to floods, and to extreme weather hazard than other parts of the world. And the combination with conflict make it very difficult for the countries, for the population, and for the state where they can function to cope with this reality. And the eighth fact that we wanted to underline is the impact of the debt crisis. The global increase in public debt is preventing many governments from investing in the systems and services to prevent and address humanitarian crises. 14 countries on the watch list were in urgent need of debt relief in 2022, according to the UN. And it means that a large portion of their budget are spent on debt servicing rather than spending on social and protection services, healthcare, education, and climate resilience. As you know, there has been an increase in the interest rate for borrowing, so this situation is really an urgent matter if we want to help this country. So I will not come to a few myths, especially 5 of them, which we think are important to underline because they are like preventing to design the right political response. They are superficially attractive because they often politically offer expedient, they shift the burden of responsibility to others, and they give an excuse of country to country with power and resources from their legal, moral, and ethical obligation. And that's why we think busting these myths and replacing them with facts opens the doorway to better solutions that respond more effectively and break the cycle of crisis. So the first of these myths that we wanted to denounce in a way is the idea that humanitarian access can be measured in truckload of supplies delivered alone. It's mentioned in the video. It's not enough, of course, because the problem is there personnel to accompany this furniture, this food, for example? Is it possible for people to access to the place where it will be distributed? And so there's many more than just counting. We have seen this first, for example, in Tigray, where the government of Ethiopia at some point said, okay, we have opened the access to more trucks, but if you continue to bomb on the other side, I mean, people cannot, and humanitarian workers cannot access really the population. It's the same nowadays in Gaza. Myth 2, if you don't work with government, you can't get anything done. So, of course, it's better when you can work with government, but there is many places in these countries where governments have no control of entire territories and regions, and where if you want to deliver services, food, medicines, and other protection to the population, you need to be able to work with non-state actors, with local civil society organizations, with communities, and it's very important that the international institutions who fund most of the humanitarian support, the UN system, the World Bank, the government, are made aware of this and are changing their way of working so that you can also work with local communities. The myth 3, I mentioned it, is the idea that US and Europe are already hosting most are doing their fair share of welcoming displaced people. That's not the case at all. The watch list countries are home of 77% of people who are forcibly displaced. The myth 4 is that cutting emissions and restricting the rise of global temperature is so important that we can't afford to spend money on adapting to climate change. Even if we would success in limiting the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, the situation in these countries are already so strongly affected by the climate crisis that the drought will continue, the displacement of population because of climate event will continue, the flood risk will continue, and so we must, as part of the climate response and the climate finance, spend much more on adaptation and not just on mitigation, as it is said. And it's not the case at all today. And so it means that the people who are suffering already the more from the climate crisis are not receiving most of the climate financing and funding. And the fifth myth is that gender inequality is not a matter of life and death. It is. Most of the displaced people are women and girls, 80%. They are much more exposed than men when they are leaving their home and in camps or on the road, and they are suffering more from food insecurity, for example. So supporting women and girls, having in mind the specificity of the gender inequality in humanitarian context, is absolutely key to design the proper response. And to conclude, I will speak about what we consider as our main priorities for action and recommendation that we want to underline in this report. The first is that it's linked to the link between climate crisis and conflict-affected context. It is important to, as I mentioned it, to redirect part of the climate effort in climate adaptation, resilience, and anticipatory action. And we make very specific proposal that 50% of all public climate finance to developing countries should be allocated to adaptation by 2025. And this is in line with the UN Secretary General target. It is not at all the case today. We propose also that 20% of all multilateral development bank and other multilateral climate finance affected to climate and climate impacted countries should be channeled via non-governmental organizations, including local NGO and women's-led organizations, and that a minimum of 5% of humanitarian budget should be spent on anticipatory action with a strategy for further expansion by 2030. There is one country which has already took such a decision, which is Germany. 5% of their ODA are dedicated to anticipatory action, and we think that it is of the utmost importance for the other country to do the same. Second proposal is to target extreme poverty and the drivers of riser humanitarian need. In fact, it's also linked to the same general idea, but it's more a proposal for the World Bank, which is really the UN and international institution which has the mandate to combat extreme poverty. But it's clear that if we want to achieve a result, we need this institution to shift also from just doing big loans to state actors. By definition, that's the way World Bank and other international development banks have been working, to developing those mechanisms that they have established, but which are just a small part of their action to support non-state actors, local communities, and to reorient also more through grants and donations and through loans their support to this fragile context. The third one is to prioritize gender equality in crisis response and shift power and resources to women-led organizations. We have seen in many places that it's very difficult to have the proper support to women's-led organizations, from Ukraine to African countries, for many different reasons. Why there is a lot of local women-led organizations, but they are facing a lot of obstacles in terms of compliance, in terms of capacity, so they need to be supported for this. And we think also that the women's protection program can be much more developed. We are doing a lot of them, for example, creating safe space for women and girls in any kind of humanitarian response is a very important tool of protection, but also of assessing the needs of women and girls and giving them access to humanitarian services. The first one is to promote a shared prosperity by increasing aid and tackling the debt crisis. So I mentioned the importance of the debt crisis. Here I would like to underline a problem that we are facing since many years with the overseas development assistance, so the international and public aid. There are today only 5 of the OECD countries who are respecting their commitment to dedicate 0.7% of their national revenue to ODA. If only the 7 countries of the G7 were respecting their commitments, it will bring an additional 30 billion to, an additional 168 billion to international aid. So first, there is a call for all rich countries to respect their commitments to international aid. There is even some countries who have been doing more than 0.7. It's possible. Unfortunately, they are changing their policy now, but Sweden, for example, until a few years ago, was aiming and respecting for a while the target of 1% of GDP to international aid. We also propose that half of all bilateral ODA are directed to fragile and conflict-affected states, so especially these 20 countries. There's a few others, while it's only 25% now. So it means that as we have such a concentration in these few countries of most of the needs, it will be logic to dedicate much more parts than 25% of the international aid to these places if we really want to see extreme poverty, famine, and other diseases to be tackled properly. So we made several proposals which are linked to this. The fifth one is to support and protect forcibly displaced people. And as we are in Paris, in a European country, I just want to say that we have demonstrated in the past 2 years that it is possible to offer a proper protection to refugees when we have been welcoming Ukrainian refugees. And it shows that it is possible when there is the political will. So, of course, the support of the population was there, but the support of the population was also there because the leaders, the politicians, were explaining why it was important to welcome these refugees. We need to ensure that refugees, wherever they are supported the same way, with a legal statute, with access to social services, with access to education, with access to housing. And we have to keep in mind that most of these refugees and displaced people are not in Europe or in the US, but are in southern countries, and that helping these countries to properly welcome and support these refugees will be maybe the best way to answer to the question of those who say they will all come to Europe and try to cross the Mediterranean Sea. We don't do this, and we should and we could do it. The sixth proposal is to stem impunity and reinforce international humanitarian law. So I suppose that Mrs. Charbord will be able to speak about this because she's a human rights international lawyer and a specialist in this issue. And I already mentioned the fact that we see a totally lack of respect of international humanitarian law, which is a shame because at least, democratic countries should be absolutely clear on doing this. We make also some proposals because there are some concrete proposals. For example, we support the French and Mexico proposal and declaration to suspend the use of the veto right in case of mass atrocity in votes in the Security Council in the United Nations. We also propose that there is the establishment of a new independent access organization to improve the reporting on access and raise awareness of its impact, to catalyze action by global, regional, and national level policymakers. Again, also in the situation, in the case of the Ukraine war, there are international inquiry which are open to register all the violation of human rights and international humanitarian law. This should be done for all other conflicts. So With this, I will conclude. I've been too long, I'm sorry. We think that this proposal should be discussed internationally, should be advocated for, and that they are necessary for answering to this urgent and deteriorating situation, especially in this country. And I'm happy to discuss this with you and to answer to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this extremely thorough, but also extremely sobering presentation of the findings of the report. I think that the debunking of myths is really important because it really shows that the starting point to any analysis and to any to start addressing any problem is to actually understand the problem. I was also I think that the report makes some extremely detailed recommendations, and I think that is also extremely helpful. And it really, this report brings together, as you very well showed, some of the most pressing issues of our time, the role of conflict, of long, sustained, protracted conflicts, the convergence of climate change, the lack of preparedness of many of the countries that are on this list to climate change, limited or inexistent governance, ungoverned spaces filled by non-state armed group, which you referred to as well, and how all of these elements converge with and interact with conflict to ultimately exacerbate humanitarian crises. I was really particularly interested in 2 points that you raised. The first one is the specific role of non-state armed groups in the emergence and perpetuation of conflict. I note that this element comes up both as a cause of conflict, but also as a consequence of bad governance and these empty spaces that you referred to, weak state capacity and lack or little legitimacy of existing governments. At the same time, you said that sometimes it isn't possible to deal with existing governments. So other actors, including these non-state armed groups, will need to be part of the humanitarian response, notably through the question of humanitarian access. And yet in many of the countries that the report refers to, and you mentioned a couple in the Sahel, the fact that there is a qualification of these groups as terrorist groups, either internationally or by the governments in place, I imagine that this makes access even more complex. So maybe that was just an issue I wanted to pick up on. Maybe it'll come back up during the discussion, but I think that's quite an important one. The second one is, and I'll mention it very briefly, is the question of gender equality. And it really comes across extremely starkly as both as part of the problem and as part of the solution. The numbers provided in the report I found extremely striking. Despite the fact that gender-based violence can affect up to 70% of women and girls in conflict settings, gender-based violence programming is the least funded sector in coordinated humanitarian plans, and only 13% of this programming is actually funded. So I was very encouraged by the extremely strong recommendation that relates to the prioritization of gender equality in responses and increased resources to women's organizations. So thank you very much. So I'm going to be opening the floor for Q's and A's in a second, but I will use the privilege of being up here to ask the first question. And it relates to international law. You made very clear that one of the main reasons for humanitarian crises and these long protracted conflicts is the lack of respect for the most basic rules, frankly, of international law, and you called it the age of impunity. Now, there must be many reasons for this disregard of humanitarian law, and I can pick up a couple from the report, including the proliferation, indeed, of these non-state armed groups, the fact that you mentioned this internationalization of civilian conflicts, and the fact that there is this assistance that is being brought in to various groups, but also to governments. And then at the same time, I'm a bit surprised to see, so there is this complete impunity for war crimes and potential crimes against humanity, and you mentioned even the possibility of genocide. But at the same time, we are seeing a number of court cases come up. And there was one very recent one, but there's been a few in the last few years where it seems that part of the issue with conflict is that it is being brought in front of these international courts. So maybe there's two questions in one, you don't have to answer both, but if you could give your thoughts about why we are in this age of impunity and how we can address it when it comes to very practically addressing it on the battlefield, how we ensure that there is respect for IHL, and then maybe also if you had thoughts about this sort of parallel resurgence of the law in conflict situations through other means. I'm thinking about, for instance, the International Court of Justice being seized a few times in recent years. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And of course, one of the problems is that some of the UN security permanent members who are supposed to be like the guardian of the international law in general and international humanitarian law in particular are not themselves taking care at all of it, that they are opposing their veto every time there is an attempt to take a decision, or almost every time there is an attempt to take a decision in the Security Council. So we see some votes in the General Assembly, but those are not binding. And in the Security Council, the role of the Security Council is frozen on this issue. And of course, this means that state actors who are involved in some conflict, but also non-state actors, have not a lot of risk or fear to face international justice. It is the case in a very few countries, in very few conflicts. In most of the case, they know that there will be no international decision to bring them in front of a court. So it has been the case previously in the Balkans War, for example. We've seen some people who were involved in genocide or crimes against humanity activities being brought in front of the court, but there is less in the current conflict. And the reason why this state in the Security Council don't want to do this is because they don't want themselves to be exposed to this. And so I think we have to advocate first for those who have the more international responsibility to abide to these rules. For example, we have made a proposal, not in this report, in the last year, that there is more stringent link between the military cooperation of a democratic state with everyone else and training of military to respect international law. So, I mean, this should be much more important in our international policies, in our foreign policies. But that's also why we make the proposal to have an independent body, especially for a specific aspect, which is the violation of the right to access. And so we think it is important to have independent bodies which are not under the risk of being vetoed as the decisions are in the Security Council, which will be recognized by the UN, which will be given a mandate to observe the respect of humanitarian access. In principle, all states say in the Security Council that they respect humanitarian access, and so an independent body could look and investigate the different situations and raise an alarm when there is a problem of access, and then bring testimony, reports, and independent expertise so that the international community can take decision to enforce the respect of international humanitarian access.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we'll now turn to questions. We have approximately half an hour. So maybe what we'll do is we'll collect 2-3 questions and then maybe turn to you for an answer. And I can already see some hands being raised. It's wonderful. But maybe when you ask your question, if I could just ask that you give us your name, where you're from, and what you're studying here at PSIA, that would be great. So I see. Ah. Perfect.
Ah, d'accord, ça va. So, please, you're gonna permit me to actually talk in two languages, that is French and English, please. Is it possible for me? Is it okay for me?
Yes, it's fine.
In French and English. So, my name is Patricia. I am from Cameroon. I was privileged to be selected at the Emergency Initiative 2024. And for those who do not know about the Marian Initiative, it's all about human rights defender. I know that most of you guys are actually learning human rights right now, and maybe we might have the chance at the end of this conference to actually exchange a little bit on each and everyone's commitments and engagements for our fights and activisms. So thank you very much for the brilliant presentation that you just gave. But it brought to myself some millions of questionings and maybe answers and maybe, I don't know, propositions and suggestions. So it'll be questions, but I'll have suggestions too. And my first question is firstly on the criteria for the elaboration of the watch list. So I really want to know, because according to your presentation, you talked about climate change and conflict. And I think it's 10 prioritized countries, and there was the rest, that was second half, that was not actually prioritized, if I'm not wrong. So my question was, what was the criteria? But if the criteria was conflict and climate change, I wonder why Cameroon is not integrated in the list. I really wonder why Cameroon is not actually integrated in the list, because I know International Rescue Committee is present in Cameroon, and I know the town exactly where International Rescue Committee is present. And is it in that town that conflict is actually happening? We have a conflict called the Anglophone crisis that actually started since 2016. And maybe some of you guys do not know the story of Cameroon right now. But Cameroon is actually facing, since 2016, a crisis known as the Anglophone crisis. And so many of Cameroonians, like Anglophones, part of my country, are actually dying. It's true, and are actually facing a large number of internally displaced people. We also have climate change issues, and you have reports. And I also know that surely my government is not actually willing to share some information publicly or internationally with other international governments, but I know you're present into my country, so you have data. So I'll stop there for the first questions. So for the second question, is a questioning that does not really need an answer, but it's just a questioning, just for your knowing, or maybe a reflection, maybe afterwards. I saw, according to your presentation or the video, that you highlighted climate change as a priority for humanitarian actions in these countries. And if Cameroon is inside or may be integrated in the list, one never knows. Because I know Cameroon, like the other African countries, are also facing the same issues. How can we actually integrate climate change in an atmosphere or an environment where people have stopped to be educated? How would they know how to intervene about climate change? So, should we put it as priority for African countries? I don't know about the European countries which are in conflict or whatsoever. I can talk about something that I don't master, but I actually master for African countries, especially for Cameroon, which is my country. So, do you really think that climate change will be a priority for Cameroonians, in brackets, if they are not educated? Because most of these internally displaced people are not being educated because their official document has been burnt, have been destroyed, and have been missing. So most of these people are not going to school because also of the resources, they don't have any money. So how can we do that if they are not educated, if they can't even understand what is all about climate change? Because it's something that we don't master in Africa. That is a question that does not need forcefully an answer. So I really totally agree with the point 3 of the facts of global powers drive and intensify armed conflict. I agree with that. I really wanted us to agree on something. But there is something that I really want us to talk about. And I think with my colleagues, we actually talked about it on Monday, about the sustainability mechanisms of international aids. I'll first put it into suspension.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Patricia, could you come to your question, and then
yes.
we can get others to speak as well. Thank you.
Because I will come to my point where we talked about, it's a myth, it's about the point on myth. Is it important to work with the government? If you do not work with the government, nothing can be done. Question mark. That was a myth. Most of the time, I do not agree with my government. I want to admit that. But I think for sustainability issues, we have international community or international organization have to collaborate with the government. Why am I saying that? I'll take a slight example, a simple example. You can't come into a house without seeing the father. It's of no use. You have to pass by the father to go to the house. So that because the father is supposed to be the chief of the house, that means he knows everything about his house. If you come and go directly to the children, you might not have the sufficient element to solve the problem of the family. So what am I saying right now is that, I'll now speak in French if you want to. Ce que je suis en train de dire maintenant, c'est quoi? C'est qu'il faut intégrer le gouvernement dans l'implémentation même des projets qui concernent un État. Pourquoi? Parce qu'il faut savoir que les gouvernements ont ce qu'on appelle le plan stratégique national. Et il faut que toutes les interventions, que ce soit au niveau national ou bien international, soient intégrées et doivent prendre en compte le plan stratégique national. Parce que ce plan stratégique national n'a pas été élaboré de façon éphémère ou bien de façon aléatoire. Non. Ça a été fait à partir d'une étude, une descente sur le terrain pour pouvoir acquérir des besoins spécifiques par rapport à la population. Et c'est vrai, on doit utiliser la société civile pour implémenter les projets. Oui, mais il faut une coordination, une supervision du gouvernement. Je pense qu'en travaillant ensemble avec ces 3 identités, c'est-à-dire le gouvernement, la société civile et les organisations internationales, pour pouvoir faire ou bien opérationnaliser des interventions, ça aura beaucoup plus un impact que de travailler uniquement directement avec la société civile. Parce qu'on ne connaît pas toujours les intentions réelles de la société civile ou bien même réelles de l'État. Donc, c'est bien de travailler avec eux. Donc, c'est vrai que j'avais plusieurs questions et j'en ai même encore plus. Mais je pense qu'on va en discuter peut-être après. Ça sera peut-être un B2B pour pouvoir élargir un peu nos connaissances ou bien élargir notre expérience. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Patrick. And maybe we'll just keep, for the next questions, maybe just one question per intervener. I think there was, yes, over here, there were a couple more. Yes, please. Maybe you go first in the interest of time, and then we'll have...
Okay, Alessio from Italy. I'm too in international security. Just have a quick question about, like, in particular, the Sahel region that you highlighted in the watch list. And it's a little bit related, I guess, to the second question that the colleague was making before, about the acceptance of, for example, climate change above all. In an environment that is constantly affected by jihadism, jihadist attacks, in which there are lots of constitutional changes of government, mostly related to, let's say, hardcore security, how can we, to some extent, make the population accept the fact that there is something that can even go above that and can represent even, you know, a higher priority beforehand, before that one? Thank you.
Okay, and then maybe, yeah, you go, and then we'll give you an opportunity to reply.
Creo que le tengo que hacer así. Yo solamente tengo una pregunta. Soy mexicana, trabajo el tema del desplazamiento interno forzado en México. Hablo solo español, pero también somos una organización muy pequeña que iniciamos a trabajar desde el 2011.
Hi, I'm Mexican and I work on the issue of internal displacement. I work with a very small organization there and I only speak Spanish, I'm sorry.
Una pregunta tenía nada más. ¿Qué tipo de ayuda humanitaria llevan en esos países que dicen que usted mencionó?
So I just have one main question. What type of material humanitarian aid do you give to those specific 20 countries that you had in that list? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Would you like maybe to answer?
Yes, so thanks for these questions. The first one from Patricia about why not Cameroon. So first, I want to say that the fact that other countries are not on the watch list doesn't mean that the situation in them is wonderful. There's a lot of countries outside of this list where we are present, we are delivering humanitarian aid because the situation make it necessary. It just means that in these countries, we see a risk of deterioration or of very high number of people in risk of famine, of other kind of exposure to disease. And we are in Cameroon, you're right, we continue to have programs in Cameroon. I did not enter into the details of the criteria. There is 65 quantitative criteria and then qualitative analysis. So if you look at the countries which are in the watch list, you will see that there are, for example, the number of people like Sudan in humanitarian need. 24 million, for example, in the case of Sudan. The number of people who are internally displaced. In other countries, the number of people who are exposed to food insecurity. So, and the risk of deterioration. The fact that we don't see so far a prospect of this situation being correctly tackled by the international community, the right support being bring to this context. So that's the first thing, and we can discuss about we use a lot of data which are coming from others, not only ours. There are a lot of reports which are published every year, first by the UN agencies, especially, I mentioned, for example, the food insecurity situation with the classification IPC 3, 4, 5, which are all different levels of food crisis. Those are established by the UN agencies. We take them into account. We don't. The same for the displaced people, the number of forced displaced people, refugees or internally displaced people, which are numbers published by the UN High Commission for Refugees. We combine all of this with our own analysis on the ground. And for example, for South Sudan, we also take into account the fact that there will be, I don't know if it's mentioned here or not, there will be the first ever presidential election in this country at the end of this year between the current president and vice president, who are enemies, who have already been at wars before. And we see this as a risk. For example, in a context where we also see that El Niño will provoke a new drought, and so with this come a lot of disease, and that there is a war in Sudan, and I explained the consequences on South Sudan. So that's an example. You had a question, and also the colleague from Italy, which was linked to climate change and how it is perceived by population. So I would say two things. First, for the population in most of these countries, climate change, it's not a concept. It means drought, or floods, or famine, displacement, and so they are aware that there is more drought than before. For example, in Somalia, I mentioned in the past 3 years there have been 5 unsuccessful consecutive rain seasons. They know it's not normal, even if there was already in 2011, in 2015, important drought. But it was not consecutively 5 times as it was now. And so it's about the fact that, and that's the second thing, we have to ensure that there will be the proper policy which are linked to the fact that this reality will not change, unfortunately. We can hope. This year there has been some rain at the end of last year in Somalia, but we know it will happen again. So, for example, we are insisting on climate financing going to this context. That's where it's important to be able to work not only with the states, because the states not always control the totality of the territories. I speak here about Somalia. We could speak about Mali, for example. The state is not controlling more than 50% of the territory of Mali. So there's not the majority of the population is more than 50%, but there is millions of people. And so how can we ensure that the international support, let's say the climate financing, which are existing there in the World Bank system and elsewhere in our international humanitarian funding, is going to the local communities, not to armed groups, but to the local communities, so that they can benefit from this support. One thing we have been experiencing in terms of anticipatory action, which we think is very important for coping with climate change, was in Nigeria. Contrary to what is done usually, you will give support, for example, cash to families and communities who are affected by a flood, so that they can rebuy food, cattle, and so on. We have experience with the support of Google and the meteorological organization of the country of Nigeria, the fact to give anticipatory cash before an event. There's a lot of extreme event weather which can be predicted some days, sometimes some weeks before. So we help the communities before the floods. And of course, the result of the study, there was a comparison with another group which benefit from classical post-trauma support, is that they cope better if they have the funds before to protect their belongings, to protect the cattle, to protect the food they have, and so on. So that kind of system, of course, it means a change. in the way we are working. That's what we mean by including climate approach in the way we deal with community affected by conflict. Why is there such a link between climate and conflict also? Because, of course, when there is drought and scarce resources, water is more difficult, there's less land which are at disposal for agriculture, there is more competition and more combat between groups for the access for these natural resources. And also we see armed groups recruiting more of the people to protect their own groups or to revenge and so on. So there is a kind of spiral of the link between conflict and climate change, and also the lack of capacity of state and government to support the population who are affected in some places, leave more space for these non-state armed groups, and so that's where we see the increase of the consequences of climate change. Regarding Mexico, so you ask what we are doing in these countries. By the way, we are in Mexico, working especially with migrants, people coming from Venezuela, and we also support those migrants people when they arrived in the United States and helping them to resettle in more than 20 cities in the United States. We mentioned in the report Ecuador, but in fact all along the road from Venezuela, where there is a huge refugee and displaced population, to the US, we have programs. So, as I said at the beginning, the work of the IRC in the different countries goes from emergency, like people are displaced, they need food, we will provide food, or sometimes it could be better, I just say this, to provide cash, for example, to the people so that they can buy food on the market if the market are still functioning. We have a lot of programs which are linked to health. In fact, the nutrition program for the young children are also health programs. It's life-saving programs, but there is immunization program, vaccination. For example, now we have a very important partnering with Gavi, which is the international gathering for providing vaccines to ensure access to vaccine to especially population who are in out-of-reach area not controlled by government, including in border region, for example, between Somalia and Ethiopia. How you do to ensure that population who are moving beyond the borders, depending on the season, their children will have access to vaccine and that they will be followed wherever they are by mobile clinics, for example. We are also providing, as I said, safe space and protection for women and girls and programs to ensure that women who are exposed to gender-based violence can be protected, can speak about it, can have access to justice if there is a judicial system, or are protected by our programs. We have educational programs providing education for young children, millions of them, in African countries, in Middle East countries. So we have a lot of very different programs, and it goes up to, in some places, helping people for economic empowerment and well-being, which means creating their own small business, developing economic activities. And we also have programs of support to refugees and integration in Europe, for example, in Italy, in Germany, in the UK, in the US. So we work, as we say, under following the arc of crisis, from the beginning of a crisis where people are displaced or are leaving their home because of a conflict or natural disaster, up to their resettlement and the ways they can regain control on their life and their future. Yes.
Okay, so we'll take the 3 questions here. I know it's 7. We're going to do this like speed questioning.
Thank you very much. So I'm Chiara. I am in the Master of International Development. You were mentioning the 2 opposite dynamics of the need for debt relief, but interest rates going upward. I would like to know in what way Rescue International and other NGOs advocate or have a role and a voice in the making of these policies, as they are endangering a lot the development. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Agnese from Italy, doing international security. So, in the last couple of years, we've witnessed the reduction and the decreasing of funds for humanitarian aid. The example is, for example, for me, it was Syria, that we witnessed welfare program of their nutrition fund for nutrition programs in Syria. So my question, I guess, is how do you see a future in terms of the role of international NGOs and NGOs in, it will be more a competitive future among them to achieve the funds needed, or would it be establishment of a mechanism to try and rebalance and reallocate budget where we can witness, for example, overly funded project, for example, in Ukraine, or lack of funding in Syria, for example. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'll make this quick. My name is Layal. I come from Lebanon. I'm doing human rights and humanitarian action. Basically, my country is one of the countries mentioned, which makes sense to why I'm here. My question towards, actually is a practical one. On the ground, humanitarian workers, in terms of immunity, I mean, what we're witnessing today in Gaza is hundreds and thousands of journalists and medics and humanitarian workers, including UN staff, as you've mentioned, are being killed. What are the measures taken against the state that is aggressing all of the laws of international law and disrespecting all of the provisions that have been declared by the ICJ? Are there any? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this question. First, on the debt. So one of our duty is to speak for the people we serve. And so we are not an actor directly of the debt issue, but we have to say that we see the impact of the increased number of countries who are in a bad debt spiral on their social and humanitarian situation. Second thing, we made some new proposal which we are advocating for and speaking to with several states, including European states, the EU, the US, which are to implement a debt swap system, which has been experienced for the protection of ocean and other environmental purpose, where you, in exchange of taking back the debt of some poor country, you get a commitment for them to invest part of the debt they will not have to reimburse in protection of ocean and so on. So that came from an idea that some countries, they were responsible for something which is of global interest, global goods, protecting the ocean in their coastal region, but they were not able to do it. And they say one of the reasons is that we don't have the fund, we have to reimburse the debts to your own bank or to your own finance system. And so the US and some others have accepted to exchange part of the debt to the fact that they could act in this domain. So we are discussing with several states about doing such a system that in exchange for cancellation of part of the debt, in this country, a humanitarian fund will be created. So we have to look at the governance of such a fund, because it doesn't mean you give the control of this fund to the said state, but you ensure that the part of the debt which will be saved will be spent in the state for humanitarian purpose, for social services. The question on the funding, so I've here put a slide on what we call the gap in the funding between the needs. They are formulated by the UN every year. In every country where there is humanitarian need, the UN system said we need a certain amount of funds to cope with the needs, and then they call other states, those who can, to take part to the funding. again, when we look at what happens with Ukraine, maybe you remember there has been several donors' conferences for Ukraine. 90%, sometimes more than 100% of what was required by the UN was funded. Immediately, I mean, everybody was saying, okay, Ukraine will need funds to reconstruct part of what has been destroyed or to support the population. It was done. When you look at the general situation, the gap is growing. So it's less and less funds going to the place where they are needed. It has a consequence for the international NGOs like the IRC, but also for the local NGOs, because part of this gap means that we will not receive the fund, especially through the UN channels or through the development or humanitarian fund which are existing in our countries to support the population. So it leads to your question of how to get access to new funds. We think first that it's important to develop private donation. We are raising funds to the wide public in many countries. We are also raising funds to corporations, to foundations. We are trying to convince people that it's very important to give funds to museums, to many activities like in France, where we see a lot of the philanthropy is going to this kind of project, but that there are also important international needs and that there are efficient organizations they can support. We also, and that's why we are speaking about climate, think that there should be more connection in the international community's mindset between the very important effort which will be done to respond to the climate crisis and the fact to support the population who are affected by the climate crisis now, which are in this specific country. So it's wonderful to finance, how do you call it, eolian? Windmill, and to support industry, which are doing it anyway, to invest in new ways of production without carbon emission. But it's very important also to have in mind that it's not in the future, but it is now that people are impacted by the climate crisis and that they need to be supported to cope with the consequence of this crisis. And part of it can be done through helping humanitarian actors who are doing more than just emergency response. As I said, in most of the places, first that we see in the watch list, when there is conflict, the average duration is already more than 7 years. When there are camps, most of the camps are more than 20 years old, which means that some people have been growing up in this camp, which means that humanitarian response is a part of the development response when it is well done. It's not just an emergency response. It's part of finding a long-term solution in terms of education, health, economic development, climate adaptation, and so on. About the third question on the disrespect of humanitarian law, especially in Gaza, and the killing of aid workers, yes, I mentioned it. This is absolutely dramatic, and that's why we are calling for an immediate and sustained ceasefire. Again, first for humanitarian access, it's not just the number of trucks which counts, it's the fact that people can deliver the support. Second, it's impossible to send teams if they are under permanent shelling. And we had a team who was working in the Nasser hospital together with another international organization, medical assistance for Palestinian, and they had to withdraw from the place because even if the hospital itself was not bombed, but all around it was bombed, so entering and getting out for the patient and for the humanitarian actors were very risky. And then the place where they were staying, which was supposed to be a safe one, which was registered as such towards the authority of Israel, has been bombed while people were there. They were not killed, but they were injured, and so they had to evacuate. So yes, it's clear that here it cannot continue like that. And again, the law of war exists. International humanitarian law are their name, and it makes a clear distinction between the combatant and the civilian, and this is indispensable to support the civilian who are victims of war. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was an extremely interesting conversation, and thank you to all who asked questions, and I'm sure there were many who didn't get to ask questions. And I want to thank them for staying as well. Thank you very, very much. On behalf of all the students, I'm sure I'm saying this, but also on behalf of Sciences Po PSIA, thank you for giving us your time and your insights on some of the findings and also on the many challenges that are still to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your invitation.